Hey guys, 2023 has come and gone, and I'd say it was a pretty good year for reality TV. We had a couple of good Survivor seasons, some interesting Big Brother seasons to say the least, and obviously a couple other shows along the way. And now that the year is drawing to a close, it is time to do our 2023 Gumball Awards. And the categories are largely the same as last year, but a big addition this year is we will be including Big Brother into a lot of these categories, so stay tuned for that. But let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the awards. So first up we have Best Tribe, and admittedly a lot of this is entertainment based, but we do have a couple nominees here. Where first up we have Lulu from Survivor 45, and obviously they're on here because of how in-depth they were in challenges, and that led to some pretty fun moments there, particularly the Sabaya tribal. I also consider the Bello tribe from 45, where they were also kind of a trainwrecky tribe, although for different reasons, where it just seemed like they weren't on the same page. There was a lot of animosity on that tribe, obviously, that played out in the post-merge here. And I also consider the Villains tribe from Australian Survivor, and they were actually very close to getting the award, as it had some pretty top-tier characters on here, people like George, people like Shawnee. Again, a lot of great figures here. But admittedly, I thought a lot of the newbies on the tribe were kind of lackluster, and I feel like they kind of dragged down their average here. So in the end, the award goes to Tika from 44. And admittedly, I thought Tika kind of has a similar issue to the Villains tribe, where admittedly some of the earlier boots on the tribe aren't as notable. People like Bruce obviously doesn't have much of a factor on 44. Even Helen is kind of there. Sarah is also just kind of there. But I feel like compared to the Villains tribe, I feel like the overall entertainment value of Tika is higher. So I feel like for that reason, I gave them the award. Next up, we have the Worst tribe. And admittedly, there weren't too many considerations here. I feel like there weren't too many tribes that were too bad at the end of the day, where the main nominee here was Calaton from UK. And it's not as if Calaton's like a bad tribe per se. They're just kind of boring in the grand scheme of things. But ultimately, the award here goes to the Heroes tribe from Australian Survivor. And again, I feel like they're mostly a lackluster tribe. I mean, yes, they have some big characters, people like Sean, people like Haley, but I feel like a lot of the newbies on that tribe are particularly under-edited. And I feel like by the end, like, they didn't really stand out too much to me. Now, admittedly, they're not the worst tribe in the world, but I feel compared to the other tribes that we saw from this year, I feel like they didn't quite stack up as much to me. Next up, we have favorite character, and this includes both Survivor and Big Brother here, and there are actually quite a bit of nominees here. Where first up, we have Matthew from 44. I feel like Matthew was such a fun character during the pre-merge, definitely one of the bigger characters there, and it's really a shame that we didn't get to see more of him in the post-merge, but he was still really fun to watch and really fun to see him play. We also have Carolyn, also from 44, and I feel like Carolyn was a very big character as well. Obviously, having this big storyline throughout the season, that was all pretty good. You also have Jam Jam, who's a very energetic figure as well during the season. He was a very fun narrator and a pretty satisfying winner from an entertainment perspective, but I feel like he didn't quite crack it for me. Moving over to 45, we have two considerations here. We have Jake. I thought Jake was a very likable character, someone who had a very interesting story arc during the season. And he was someone that I very much related to, considering how much he failed and considering how much he struggled to garner respect out there. So I found that aspect pretty interesting. We also have Emily, sort of similar to Carolyn, being this pretty big character with a pretty big journey edit during the season. Someone who came into the season as someone who didn't care about the journey and that she only wanted to win. And it's really awesome that we got to see her go on to the season. And while she did change during the course of the season, really changing her mentality, it was still very fun to watch her there. And then moving over to Big Brother, I also considered Corey. And I thought Corey was another pretty fun character as well. Sort of this hyper super fan who obviously liked to talk a lot to the cameras and the live feeds. He would do his own stock watches during the week, and that was fun to compare. And while I didn't care as much for his showmance with America, he was still a very endearing character and someone who I'm glad made it as far as he did. But ultimately, I did decide to give the award to George from Australian Survivor. And I feel like George is one of the best characters in really all Survivor. He's such a fun narrator, someone who was a very big player. And I was just so happy to see him come back and have another deep run in him. So I feel like he was a pretty clear shoo-in for the award. Next up, there's favorite moment, and there were quite a few contenders here as well. Where first up, you have the Fraser tribal from Australian Survivor. Again, really insane tribal. You also have George really leaning into the theatrics of it all, and it felt like it was going back and forth for a lot of it. Now, I will say the one thing holding it back is it was reliant on a twist where obviously Simon was the boot coming into it. And it was through this twist where there was this individual immunity challenge that Simon ended up winning that really caused a lot of the chaos to ensue. That and also the eventual boot in Frasier wasn't really much of a character on his own. So I feel like that's something. But again, it was still really fun to watch. Next up, you have the Maddie tribal from 44. Again, another really insane tribal, a lot of crazy stuff going on, such as Matthew using his shot in the dark to hide his allegiances. You have Jamie hitting her shot in the dark at that first tribal, and then you have Brandon playing his idol, which resulted in Maddie being taken out with just one vote. Again, really explosive start to the season, but I do feel like it's harmed by the fact that the Ratus aren't as big characters down the line, and I feel like this was largely their highlight there. We also have 3 nominees from Survivor 45, none of which ended up winning. But first up, we have the Sabaya tribal. Again, another really insane tribal where obviously Sabaya ends up throwing the idol into the fire only to take it out. And then you eventually have her making this fatal mistake and not casting her vote in a spot where she was vulnerable and not even playing the idol on herself, eventually resulting in her being taken out. That was really fun. You also have the J Maya tribal where at the merge, where obviously this is the tribal where Caleb uses his shot in the dark, and he ends up negating 11 votes at this tribal, which not only breaks the record for most votes negated at a single tribal, but is also the first time where someone successfully saves themselves using a shot in the dark, which is pretty fun there. Though I will say that the eventual J Maya boot was kind of predictable considering her content up to that point, so I feel like that definitely weakened the impact at this moment, but still is really fun to watch. You also have the Julie tribal at the final 5, which is one of the most chaotic votes to ever happen this late in the game, where it ends up being a 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 vote, where Jake plays his idol on Katura, which only negates 1 vote. And you also have Katura flipping her vote at the last moment, sending out Julie over D, which is also pretty fun. So again, a pretty fun tribal there. And then the last nominee is Suri winning the Traitors, finally getting her win after all these years, which is a very satisfying moment, obviously. Though not the most entertaining in the world, it was still something worth mentioning. But in the end, I actually decided to go with Big Brother as the winner, and here we have the Izzy week, week 6 of BB25, which ended up being a really crazy week of the show, as a lot of the changes happened after the veto, which you usually don't see on Big Brother, where obviously we see Jarrett blowing up his game. He obviously gets into a massive fight with Corey, and it eventually culminates with Corey, America, and Cameron being able to flip the entire power structure and taking out Izzy, something that didn't seem likely at the time. Again, a really fun week. You obviously have a lot of great character moments, and obviously a really chaotic week in terms of gameplay. So I feel like for me, this one gets the edge. Next up, we have Best Move, and this one also had a couple of nominees here. Where first up, you have the Tanuke blindside from Survivor UK, where obviously Chris is able to pull in Matthew and Lawrence to eventually take out Tanuke, one of the biggest players in the game at that point. And I found this to be a pretty good move, definitely something that set up Matthew to eventually win the game moving forward. And coming around the heels of the Caltons getting this majority in the last round and blindsiding Doug, the leader of the Lanenas. So I found that to be a pretty good move, but again, not quite enough to reach the top tier for me. You also have the Frasier blindside from Australian Survivor. And again, this was another solid move, definitely putting George in a more solid position moving forward. He also ends up outing Simon as his liar due to him going back on his deal to people like Stevie that allows him to pull Stevie over. But again, I wouldn't say it's the best move for me. You also have the Izzy blindside from BB25, where again, Corey, America, and Cameron are able to flip the entire power structure of the house on its head, where obviously Suri had been dominating most of the pre-jury of that season, but through this one move, they are able to take out someone who is very integral to Suri's power structure, and again, sort of dismantle that moving forward to where the post-jury ends up being dominated by different people. But at the end of the day, I feel like the people responsible for this move didn't end up dominating the game thereafter. I feel like they didn't capitalize more on this move. And again, it's still relatively early within the game. So I think with that, I did decide to give the award to the Emily blindside from Survivor 45, as it was a really impressive move, where obviously it is reliant on Austin making this mistake in telling Dee about the plan to blindside Julie, which I think is reflective of Dee's relationship with Austin at that point. Dee is later able to tell Julie about this plan, and through that, Julie is able to play her idol on herself, negating all the votes there and taking out Emily, someone who, while she was a big threat by that point, is also someone who was very integral to the Austin and Drew side. And by doing this, Dee is able to really get Austin to have to work with her moving forward, which I find pretty impressive. She's able to get to the final 6 with 2 number 1s, which is pretty good. And plus, she gets almost no blowback for this move, which I think is an underrated aspect of this move as well. So I find that pretty impressive. Not to mention the fact that even coming to Final Tribal, people like Drew didn't even know that D was the one behind it. And when D revealed that, it was a big bombshell that she was able to use to really undercut Austin at the end. So I feel like considering the impressiveness of the move, coupled with the fact that it contributes to D eventually winning the game, I feel like for that reason, I have it here as the best move. Next up, we have the worst move, and this also had several nominees to consider here. Where first up, we have from Survivor 45, the final 8, where Bruce does not play his idol, being taken out with the idol in his pocket. Again, this is a pretty bad move on the face of it. It's never good to be taken out with an idol in your pocket, especially someone like Bruce, who had been this target for the last couple of rounds. This was the first round in a while where he didn't have immunity, and we even saw him planning to play the idol on himself until he got tricked at the last moment to not do so. Again, it's a pretty bad move, but the reason I don't have it as the worst move per se is that I feel like Bruce was pretty screwed either way. He was already a pretty massive target even before this, and I feel like even if he had played the idol on himself and avoided this catastrophe, he still would have been in a bad spot moving forward. He was still going to be a big target moving forward, and I don't feel like he would have won the game even if he had won his way to the end. So I feel like for that reason, it's not as bad, but it's still pretty bad. Next up, we have Katurah flipping her vote at the final 5 from D to Julie. And I feel like this is also a pretty bad move, definitely something that leads to her downfall the next round, where obviously D wins immunity there. She obviously keeps around a showmance that she had wanted to target to the final 4, which is obviously pretty bad as well. And plus, it further burns Jake to where had Jake won final immunity, he probably also doesn't take her to the end, for all we know. So I feel like it's a pretty bad move. It's also a bad look on the jury as well. Really shows her as being indecisive. But the reason I don't have it as the worst move in the world is one, I understand why she did it, where again, you can at least point out that Jake didn't tell her that he was playing the idol on her. And plus, I feel like while taking out Julie over D is pretty bad, they are both pretty big threats at that point. So obviously, it's not as if she took out a goat to keep D in the game. So I feel like that was enough to soften it, but it's still a pretty bad move. And then moving over to Big Brother, I also consider Jag taking Matt to the end of BB25, where obviously Jag ends up beating Matt, but considering everything that Jag and Matt knew within the house, he had no reason to think he would beat Jag at the end, where obviously he saw that people were more receptive to Matt's game and that it seemed like Matt was the much bigger threat to beat Jag at the end compared to Bowie Jane, and yet Jag still does it anyway, where obviously he does take out Bowie Jane. He even says in his eviction speech at the final 3 that he would be fine losing to Matt and that the one vote he would get over Matt is from Bowie Jane. And I feel like him winning at the end is more so the result of things happening outside the house within the jury house that Jag had absolutely no control over. So I feel like to that end, I feel like I do have to consider this as a pretty terrible move. But again, Jag still did technically beat Matt, even if he had no clue what was happening, but still, I wanted to consider it. But ultimately, the move I went with as the worst move is going back to BB25. We have Jared's week 6, which is a actively bad week for him, where he single-handedly blows up the power structure that Suri had built for him, a power structure that very much benefited Jared to get towards the end of the game, and yet through his lies being unraveled and him getting to fight with Corey, that really allows the people on the bottom to formulate a flip against him. And obviously he would have been the target the very next week, only for him to win HOH, but it can't be understated how bad of a week this was for Jared, where it really single-handedly sinks both his game and Suri's game moving forward. So I feel like with that, I do have this as the worst move. Next up, we have the surprise breakout player, and I feel like there were only 2 considerations for me, both of them being somewhat similar players. Where first up, we have Drew from Survivor 45, someone that was relatively low on in the preseason due to the way that people talked about him in their interviews. And I feel like he was someone that wasn't going to replicate the success of another player, but they are able to find themselves in the majority. They're able to play somewhat impressive game at the end of the day. And while I have holes with it here and there, I still find his game mostly impressive, especially compared to what I had him as in the preseason. So I did consider him at least, but ultimately I decided to give this award to Carson from Survivor 44. And I feel like Carson is the more impressive version of Drew, someone that I was very low on in the preseason. I thought he was just going to flame out, that people would see him as this know it all. But he ended up being someone that played a really dominant game, obviously physically, due to him knowing all the challenges. You have him doing pretty well strategically, which is to be expected. But I think what really impressed me was his social game, where he really bonded with most of the cast. He was able to really fit in with a wide group of people, both on his original tribe, but even on his swap tribe on Ratu. And then coming into the post merge, he was able to essentially be the brains behind the operation on the Tika 3, being able to navigate through so much of the post merge to where by the end, he was probably the biggest jury threat to win. And yes, while he was clearly the biggest threat to where he was put into fire, I still find his game very impressive compared to what I thought of him in the preseason. So for that, I do give him this award. Next up, we have the surprise disappointment, sort of the opposite here. Someone that I was high on in the preseason, but kind of underwhelmed me during the season. And again, I do have a couple nominees here, where first up we have Kane from Survivor 44, where while Kane ended up being a somewhat competent player and someone who actually made it farther than I was expecting, I found him to be kind of boring as a TV character, someone who didn't really translate to the TV screen that well. And yes, while that can be expected considering he was someone that kind of disavowed some of the thematic aspects of Modern Survivor, like going on a journey and really leaning into the emotions here, I still found Kane's portrayal in the show to be kind of lackluster in my eyes. Definitely not what I was expecting. Next up, we have Bruce from Survivor 45. Again, someone who definitely came into 45 in a solid position where he was well liked. People did want to work with him, but he ended up being such a terrible player to where he was actively targeted during most of the season, really burning a lot of the goodwill that he had coming to the season. And yes, while I wasn't expecting him to be that great of a player, I felt like with the amount of people talking about wanting to work with him, I felt like he would have been able to at least manage that for a bit, only to eventually be targeted in the post merge due to him being a big threat. But instead, he ends up being kind of disliked by most of the cast, and a lot of it's due to his poor reads. He obviously lacked a lot of awareness over his position in the game, really overestimated a lot of his relationships with the people on his tribe, and at the end was just such a bad player, really burning a lot of the potential that he did have coming to the season, that I found myself kind of disappointed by him by the end of it. And then the other honorable mention is a bit of a weird one, but we actually have Jag Baines, the winner of BB25. And again, on paper, Jag did not underperform. He was my winner pick coming into the season, and he won the season. But I feel like the way that he won the game was so fluky, and there were just so many opportunities for him to be taken out early. And even when he was dominating later on, a lot of it came solely through challenge wins. And as he harped so much on loyalty and his own calm ability, that it really made his winning game really underwhelming in my eyes. And by the end, while I was technically right about my winner pick, I wasn't particularly happy with that winner pick. So I feel like for those reasons, I do have Jag as a nominee here, but I feel like there's a very obvious winner to this award, and that is Jared Fields from BB25. And again, coming into the season, Jared is someone that people were excited to see. He was obviously on Game Changers as part of the Loved Ones visit. He was a fun character there. He was almost cast on David versus Goliath, but had to back out of that. And this was finally their opportunity to be on the show, and people were excited for that. People felt like they would come in and be a good player, sort of similar to his mother. But he ended up being pretty bad, both as a player and even as a person, where he ended up making a bunch of really terrible comments regarding women during his showmance with Blue. He also proved to be a hypocrite when it came to dating. He also made some pretty terrible comments with Matt, where obviously he would just take advantage of the fact that Matt can't hear that well and really lean into that. So obviously, not the greatest person in the world. And he also proved to be a pretty bad player as well, where while he did okay during the first week, he very quickly makes a bunch of really sloppy plays. He ends up spreading all these lies that feel unnecessary, and he eventually gets caught for. And despite Suri doing so much legwork to get him to a strong position, he ends up blowing up that position by the end of the pre-jury to where he's such a blatant threat by that point. So I feel like for all those reasons, there was really no contest. Jared is the surprise disappointment of the season. Next up, we have a new award, and that is the worst Survivor player. So just looking at the Survivor seasons that we saw from this year, and there were a couple nominees here. I mean, for one, we have Josh from 44. Again, someone who ended up being pretty bad socially to where people didn't really trust him that much. And while some of that can be due to him deciding to hide the fact that he's a doctor, I feel like he definitely showed that he doesn't have much potential at the end of the day, and I feel like he was at least worth considering. And then we also have Bruce from 44 and 45. Again, someone who's pretty bad socially to where people don't seem to like him that much. People see him as overbearing, and someone who definitely lacks a lot of awareness within the game and makes a number of questionable decisions, namely him not playing the idol at his eventual boot round. That's obviously pretty bad. And I feel like 45 was definitely one of his better case scenarios where he was well liked coming into it. People wanted to work with him. And yet, even with that best case scenario, he still ends up screwing it up early on. So I feel like for that reason, I had to consider him as well. But kind of similar to the last award, I feel like there's a pretty clear winner of this award, and that is Rogue from Australian Survivor Heroes versus Villains. And I feel like Rogue is definitely on the level of Wendy Joe from Survivor Nicaragua, where she is someone that has almost no potential coming into any season of Survivor, where she is such a blatant social pariah right off the bat to where people instantly target her. And she obviously does stuff that contributes to that. She just doesn't ever seem to shut up. She gets into confrontations with people a lot. And she is such a nuisance that we even see the other tribes celebrating after she got voted out. So I feel like that also shows how much people didn't seem to like her that much. And again, with how little potential she had and how actively bad she played during her short stint, I felt like she was pretty clearly the worst player on the Survivor side. Next up, we have the worst Big Brother player, and I feel like there were also a couple nominees for this award as well. Where first up, we have Zach from Big Brother Canada 11. Again, someone who doesn't seem to ever do well in any given season. Obviously, was a pretty massive target right off the bat, and is eventually responsible for his own boot. But I didn't give him the award as I feel like he is someone who at least had some control early on. He at least had a solid alliance, and while that alliance ended up blowing up, he still had some control within the game. You also have Red from BB25, another player with pretty bad reads, like him volunteering for the block during a week where he would have gone home had that gone through. You also have him like convincing Cameron to not do what was in his best interest during Cameron's HOH week. You also have him like willing to not use the veto on Cameron, despite the two of them being on bad terms by that point. And in general, he's someone that I have very little faith in coming into any given season. But again, he at least has some good reads, like he was able to clock the family style alliance right out the bat, and he was at least part of the majority alliance early on, even though he's eventually kicked out of it. So I feel like that was at least something. You also have Jared, also from BB25. Again, another player that played pretty actively bad despite him being given a great hand, and someone who had no reason to be taken out as early as they were. But again, he at least had some potential within the game. He at least at one point had certain allies on his side. And plus, while he wasn't the greatest competitor in the world, he at least won 2 HOHs, which is more than I can say about certain other players, but still, he's still a mostly bad player. And then the final nominee is Cameron from BB25, where while Cameron ends up becoming the first member of the jury, he obviously got voted out along the way, and is someone who was constantly on the block for most of the season, being pretty bad socially at points. Obviously, was kind of bad strategically as well. He was someone who definitely was overconfident, and he felt like he didn't need to gather information from others as he thought that he knew everything. And he's also someone that relied very much on his comp ability to get through the game. But again, he is someone that is at least solid in comps, and I feel like that's something that I can at least give him some credit for. But again, I feel like everything else about his game is pretty bad. But I think I decided to give the award to Vanessa from BB Can 11. And I feel like Vanessa is someone who probably has the least potential coming into any season of Big Brother, where again, she was pretty much on the bottom for most of her run. She's someone who probably can't win any comps, unlike people like Jared or Cameron. And she's obviously someone that got into a lot of outbursts during the season, and she's someone who eventually ends up quitting the game, which obviously isn't great. So I feel like for all those reasons, while she isn't as notable as the other nominees we got into, I feel like those things were enough to give her the award for me. And then moving on to the next award, we have sort of a combination of these two. That is the worst player of the year, sort of combining both Survivor and Big Brother. Obviously, the two nominees here are Rogue and Vanessa. And I did decide to give the award to Rogue here, as I feel like Rogue is someone who is more actively bad socially than Vanessa. I feel like Rogue is someone who never really has any allies here. And had it not been for the majority splitting their vote to avoid an idol play, she probably would have been voted out unanimously at the tribal she ended up going out in. And she really is carried more so by her tribe winning the first few immunity challenges versus anything she does on her own. So I feel like for all those reasons, I feel like Rogue is someone I have less faith in coming into any season than Vanessa. Next up, we have most rod pre-juror, and this was definitely an interesting category to say the least. And we have a couple of nominees here. Where first up we have Jordy from Australian Survivor. Again, I feel like Jordy was someone who is definitely playing decently for a lot of it. And while I think he was undercut by George at points, and while he does eventually get taken out after they swap, I still feel like he's someone who played a pretty decent game for the most part. And the other nominee I considered was David, also from Australian Survivor, who ended up making the merge, but not the jury. And I thought David was another pretty competent player, definitely someone who was in a pretty strong spot on the Heroes tribe, even though he was barely on the show. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't consider his elimination to be a robbery per se. So I think with that, I decided to give the award to Matthew from Survivor 44. And I think Matthew was definitely a pretty big player at the end of the day. Now, whether he was robbed is a big question, considering that a lot of his removal from the game is his own fault, where obviously he was the one that climbed up the rock thinking there was an advantage. He is the one who fell down and hurt his own shoulder. That eventually results in him having to quit the game. But I still feel like he would have been a pretty interesting player moving forward, and it's just a shame to see him go out pre-jury. So for that reason, I did decide to give him the award. Then we have most robbed juror, and I feel like there were very few people that made the jury on either Survivor Big Brother this year who were actively screwed over, to where I didn't feel comfortable giving too many people consideration. Where I did have one nominee in Kelly, where I feel like she was definitely screwed over by the auction twist taking away Bruce's vote. That definitely harmed the Belle's chances of getting the numbers there. But considering how divided Belle's seemed to be in that round anyway, I don't think it would have mattered too much in the grand scheme of things. So I feel like with that, there's really only one true contender for this award, and that is Matt from Survivor 44. And I feel like Matt straight up gets screwed over by the twist that happens right after the merge, where he was in a pretty good spot, being a pretty central figure within the Soka group, only for him to get swap screwed at the first round after the merge. And I think this is also made worse by the fact that he wasn't allowed to have a shot in the dark, considering he left it at camp. So I feel like for those reasons, I did decide to give Matt the award. Even though at the end of the day, it was largely a tried swap, I figured that was enough to give him the award for me. And with that, we move on to the three big awards of the year, with the first being the Survivor Player of the Year. And I feel like there were definitely a few considerations for this award. Where first up, we have George from Australian Survivor. Again, the fact that he was able to come back after being one of the biggest players from his original season, and he's able to play a largely similar game to his original appearance, where he's able to take advantage of the fact that people are keeping him around as a shield, and later take control of his original tribe, and then basically be a pretty dominant force during his season. I feel like we still see a lot of similar issues that we saw from him the first time around that leads him out of this award, but it was at least worth considering. I also considered the winner of Australian Survivor, and that is Liz. Again, I feel like she played a fine winning game during the season. Next up from 44, we do have Carson and Jam Jam. Again, two of the bigger players from that season, being able to essentially be power brokers during the post-merge as the Ratus and Sokas were going after each other there. Again, I feel like it wasn't enough for them to crack into the top tier for me, as obviously Carson didn't win. And while Jam Jam played a pretty impressive game, I feel like he didn't quite rise to the level of Player of the Year for me. Moving over to Survivor UK, the only consideration I had was the winner in Matthew. Again, he played a pretty solid game as well by a decent amount, but I feel like it just wasn't enough for me to have him as a Player of the Year. But with that, we do have the winner of the award, and that is D, the winner of Survivor 45. And I feel like Dee largely played a better version of the Jam Jam game, where she had a pretty solid alliance from early on and was able to dominate the game for a lot of it. I feel like she was more of a force in how that alliance played out compared to Jam Jam. I feel like she had more win equity compared to Jam Jam relative to her season. And I feel like there were fewer points where she was in danger, where barring the final five, she was in a very solid spot for most of the season, while still being able to pull off strong individual moves, such as the Emily Blindside at the final seven. So I feel like for those reasons, D is the Survivor Player of the Year. Next up, we have the Big Brother Player of the Year. And for this, I did have a couple of nominees as well. Where first up, we have Daniel C. from Big Brother Canada 11. Again, I feel like he played a pretty strong game, definitely a far more impressive game than Ty, the eventual winner of the season, but I feel like he was still someone who got cut towards the end due to him being a big threat and someone who just kind of was unable to win comps along the way that really cost him a lot of control by the end of it. So I feel like he didn't quite make it for me. And then moving over to BB25, we obviously have several nominees, with one of them being Suri Fields, who is obviously a pretty massive legend on Survivor and was able to come into the show in a pretty solid position despite her reputation. Now, and while some of that is due to people not having watched Survivor as much compared to you and I, she was still able to play a very strong social game where she was essentially in a dominant position for the first half of it. And while she does lose control, probably due to things her alliance did, I feel like she was able to recover pretty well, was able to play pretty decently from the bottom, and was even able to make it to the final five, which is very impressive for me. But again, I feel like by the end, she kind of had a pretty narrow path to getting to the end. So I feel like I couldn't quite consider her there. I also considered Corey, someone who was also one of the more impressive players during the season, where while he was at the bottom during points in the season, and while he does make several social faux pas, he's able to recover pretty well and is able to get all the way to the final eight. So I find all that pretty impressive, but again, not quite enough to be player of the year. And then I also consider Jag the winner of the season, but I feel like sort of similar to Ty, he is someone that doesn't really impress me with his game. I feel like he's someone who is just too blinded by loyalty and honor. He's someone who definitely got pretty annoying by talking about how he's the most deserving person there, and is someone who largely banked on comps to get his way to the game, not to mention the fact that he was voted out and had to rely on a twist to stay in the game. So while Jag ended up winning this season, I find his run here mostly unimpressive. But with that, I decided to give the award to the runner-up of BB25, and here we have Matt. Now, I'm not saying Matt's the best person either, like he definitely had some questionable comments during the season, and he's not the most active player in the world, someone that doesn't fight too much to get his way, but he was still someone that was able to navigate through the game pretty well and was pretty well liked by a lot of people there. And realistically, someone that was probably poised to win the game for a lot of it, being able to beat Jag. And obviously, Jag was so loyal to him that Jag decided to take him to the end, even accepting the fact that he might lose to Matt. And I feel like a lot of the things that caused Matt to lose the game are due to things such as his goodbye messages, which, while that is bad in itself, isn't really something you can really account for, as a lot of the players are reacting to those outside the game. So I feel like for those reasons, I did decide to give Matt the award, as I feel like he was clearly the most well-rounded game of the year. And then finally, we have the Gumball Player of the Year, sort of combining all of the seasons that were covered on the channel. And there were definitely some interesting options here. Obviously, contenders from the Survivor and Big Brother categories, where obviously you have Dee and Matt. However, I decided for this award to take a different approach, and with that, the 2023 Gumball Player of the Year is Suri Fields. Now, obviously, she did not win the Big Brother Player of the Year, but Suri was not just on Big Brother this year. She was obviously on the Traitors as well, where she played in an extremely dominant game and ended up winning the season pretty convincingly, which I find pretty impressive. But then when you combine that with the fact that she was also on Big Brother this year, also playing an impressive game on that season, it really adds up to her really being by far the player of the year, where obviously she had already been a Survivor legend for years, and to see her come back and play two really impressive games on two different reality shows is extremely impressive for me. And I feel like for all those reasons, I feel like Suri's the pretty clear-cut player of the year for me. But there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And I just want to thank you all for another great year of the channel. It was a lot of fun covering all these shows, and there is plenty to come in the new year. We obviously have a whole bunch of new shows coming down the line, with the Traitors coming out in less than 2 weeks at this point, which should be pretty fun. We obviously have more general Survivor videos coming out relatively soon, so you can look forward to that. And we have a couple of other surprises coming down the line, but we'll get to those soon enough. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.